The coal dust hung in the morning air like a prayer left unanswered, settling on the wooden sidewalks of Black Hollow as Ruth Brennan stepped down from the Greyhound bus. Her medical bag, small and worn, felt heavy in her grip despite containing only the basics: bandages, iodine, aspirin, and the precious few vials of morphine that Dr. Henley had grudgingly provided. The year was 1952. And women like Ruth were still curiosities in places like this, especially women who carried themselves with purpose despite the tremor in their left hand that had marked her as weak since childhood. The townspeople watched her approach the mining office with eyes that held no welcome. Men in grimy coveralls paused their conversations, their faces carved from the same grey stone as the mountains that surrounded them. Women peered from behind curtains, their expressions mixing curiosity with something harder to name. Ruth had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the way her hand shook more violently under their scrutiny. The familiar weakness that had convinced her own family she'd never amount to more than a burden. "You the nurse they sent?" The voice belonged to a man built like a mountain himself, broad shoulders straining against a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His name was Samuel Cray, mine foreman and unofficial king of Black Hollow. Ruth had read about him in the brief correspondence that had secured her this position, a man who'd pulled more bodies from collapsed tunnels than anyone cared to count, who made decisions that kept 300 men employed and their families fed. "Ruth Brennan," she replied, extending her good hand. The shake was brief. Testing, his palm was rough as sandpaper, marked with scars that told stories she couldn't read. "Doc Henley says you got training." Cray's eyes dropped to her trembling left hand, lingered there with the kind of assessment that weighed and found wanting. "Says you worked in Pittsburgh hospitals." 2 years, Ruth confirmed, fighting the urge to hide her hand behind her back. "Emergency ward and surgical assistance." "This ain't Pittsburgh." The words carried weight beyond geography. Behind Cray, other men had gathered, shift supervisors and senior miners, whose approval would mean the difference between success and failure in Black Hollow. "Here, you answer to me. Medical decisions go through me. No exceptions." The rule hit Ruth like a physical blow. In Pittsburgh, she'd fought daily battles for patient autonomy, had learned to navigate the hierarchies of male doctors and administrators. But this was different. This was absolute authority, the kind that brooked no argument and left no room for professional judgment. "I understand chain of command," Ruth said carefully. Her medical training screamed against such restrictions, but her practical experience whispered that survival meant playing by local rules, at least initially. "Good." Cray turned toward a wooden building that squatted beside the main mining office like an afterthought. "That's your clinic." Previous nurse lasted 3 weeks. Couldn't handle the work. Ruth followed him across the packed dirt, her shoes catching on loose stones. The clinic door stuck, warped by mountain moisture, and Cray had to put his shoulder to it. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of autumn sunlight that revealed a space barely larger than a Pittsburgh tenement room. 2 examination tables, a desk missing 1 leg, shelves empty except for a few bottles of questionable vintage. "Supplies come monthly," Cray continued, running his finger along a dusty surface. "What you get is what you make do with. No special orders, no exceptions. You treat who I say you treat, when I say you treat them." The second rule landed heavier than the first. Ruth's medical oath, sworn just 3 years ago in a ceremony that had felt like entering sacred orders, demanded that she treat all patients regardless of ability to pay or social standing. But here, in this gray town wrapped in coal dust and mountain shadows, even her medical ethics would be subject to Samuel Cray's approval. "What about emergency situations?" Ruth asked, testing the boundaries of this new world. "You call me. I decide." Cray moved to the window, gazing out at the mine entrance where men were beginning to gather for the evening shift change. Had a nurse before who thought she knew better than established procedure. Caused problems. Ruth sensed a story behind those words, something cautionary and sharp. But before she could probe deeper, the clinic door banged open and a woman entered with the force of a storm front. She was younger than Ruth by perhaps 5 years, but her face held the kind of hardness that came from living close to grief. "Sam Cray," the woman said, her voice carrying an edge that could cut glass. "Mama sent me to fetch the new nurse. Billy Hendricks took sick this morning. Won't eat, won't drink. Burning up with fever." Ruth moved toward her medical bag, but Cray's voice stopped her cold. "Mary Ellen, you know the rules. All medical requests come through proper channels." Mary Ellen's eyes flashed. "Proper channels? That boy is 5 years old, and he's dying while you talk about channels." The tension in the room thickened like coal smoke. Ruth understood immediately that she was witnessing more than a disagreement about procedure. This was a test, a public examination of where her loyalties would lie in the complex web of authority and need that governed Black Hollow. "Mrs. Hendricks has filled out the proper forms?" Cray asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You know damn well she can't read," Mary Ellen shot back. "And Jimmy's down in the mine, won't be up till midnight." Ruth's medical instincts screamed at her to grab her bag and follow Mary Ellen immediately. A 5-year-old with fever could deteriorate rapidly, could develop complications that would be beyond treatment in a place like this. But Cray's eyes were on her, measuring, waiting to see if she would respect his authority or challenge it on her first day. The moment stretched, filled with the sound of shifting coal cars outside and the distant whistle of the evening shift. Ruth realized that everyone in the room understood the stakes better than she did. This wasn't really about Billy Hendricks or proper procedures. This was about establishing the fundamental dynamic that would govern every interaction, every decision, every life or death choice she would face in Black Hollow. Ruth's mind raced, seeking the kind of creative solution that had served her well in Pittsburgh emergency rooms. The rule was clear: all medical requests through proper channels. But what defined proper channels? What constituted a request? "Mary Ellen," Ruth said carefully, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I wonder if you might help me understand something. As a new resident of Black Hollow, I'm trying to learn local customs. When someone mentions that a child is unwell, is that considered conversation or a formal medical request?" Mary Ellen caught on immediately, her eyes brightening with something that might have been hope. "Why, just conversation, Miss Brennan. Just neighborly concern." "I see." Ruth turned to Cray, whose expression had shifted to something more calculating. "And if I were to pay a social call on a family, as new residents often do, that wouldn't require any special paperwork, would it?" The foreman studied her for a long moment, and Ruth saw a flicker of something that might have been approval cross his features. She had found a loophole, a way to serve her medical conscience while technically respecting his authority. It was the kind of clever maneuvering that suggested she might survive Black Hollow after all. "Social calls are your own business," Cray said finally. "As long as you remember that any medical treatment requires proper authorization." Ruth nodded, already reaching for her bag. "Of course. I'll just be making a friendly visit to welcome myself to the community." But as she followed Mary Ellen out of the clinic, Ruth caught Cray's parting words, delivered in a tone that carried the weight of prophecy. "Clever nurses don't last long here, Miss Brennan." The last one learned that the hard way. The threat hung in the mountain air as Ruth hurried through streets that seemed to close around her like a fist. Behind them, she could feel Cray watching from the clinic window, and she understood with sudden, chilling clarity that her real test was just beginning. The Hendricks house squatted at the end of a row of identical company cottages, each one painted the same faded green that marked them as mine property. Mary Ellen led Ruth up steps that sagged under their weight, past windows glazed with coal dust and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of kerosene and something else, the sweet, sick odor of fever. Billy Hendricks lay on a narrow bed in the front room, his small body wrapped in quilts that his mother had probably stitched by lamplight during endless winter evenings. His face was flushed with the kind of heat that Ruth recognized immediately as dangerous, and his breathing carried a raspiness that suggested complications beyond simple fever. "How long has he been like this?" Ruth asked, kneeling beside the bed and opening her medical bag. 2 days, Mrs. Hendricks replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Started with headaches, then the fever. Won't take water, won't eat nothing. Ruth placed her hand on the boy's forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of serious illness. But as she reached for her thermometer, she became aware of other sounds. Footsteps on the porch, low voices gathering outside. Word had spread quickly in the way of small towns, and half of Black Hollow seemed to have materialized to watch the new nurse work. Through the window, Ruth could see Samuel Cray approaching with several other men. Her clever solution had bought her time to reach the boy, but it wouldn't protect her from the consequences of actually treating him without proper authorization. She was trapped between her medical oath and the political reality of her new position, with a child's life hanging in the balance. Billy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. He tried to speak, but managed only a whispered word that sounded like stones. Ruth leaned closer, thinking she'd misheard, but the boy repeated it with more urgency. "Stones. In my chest. Heavy stones." Ruth's blood chilled. She'd heard similar descriptions before in medical journals about pneumoconiosis and other lung diseases common to mining regions. But Billy was 5 years old. He'd never been in the mines, never been exposed to the coal dust that scarred men's lungs and stole their breath. The footsteps on the porch grew louder, and Ruth realized her time was up. She had perhaps 30 seconds before Cray and his men would enter the house and demand an accounting. 30 seconds to make a decision that could save a boy's life or destroy her own future in Black Hollow. Ruth looked at Billy's flushed face, at his mother's desperate eyes, at Mary Ellen's challenging stare. Outside, she could hear Cray's voice giving quiet orders to the men with him. The moment of choice had arrived, and Ruth understood that whatever she decided now would echo through every day she spent in Black Hollow. Her hand found the morphine in her bag, the precious vials that could ease Billy's pain and buy time for his fever to break. But using them would be an act of open defiance, a declaration of war against the authority structure that governed this town. The alternative was to walk away, to leave a sick child to suffer while she filled out proper forms and waited for official approval. The door opened, and Samuel Cray stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Ruth kneeling beside Billy's bed. Behind him, other men crowded in the doorway, creating an audience for whatever would happen next. "Find everything you need for your social call, Miss Brennan." Cray's voice carried a dangerous edge, and Ruth realized that her clever wordplay had only delayed this confrontation, not prevented it. Ruth met his gaze steadily, her trembling hand somehow steady as she prepared the morphine injection. "Just being neighborly," she replied, and plunged the needle into Billy's arm. The morphine took effect within minutes, Billy's labored breathing easing into something closer to natural sleep. Ruth had administered the injection with steady hands despite the weight of Samuel Cray's stare. But now, as silence settled over the cramped front room, the magnitude of her defiance became clear. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenged an authority that brooked no challenge. "Pack your things," Cray said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of a mine collapse. "Bus leaves for Charleston at 7 tomorrow morning." Ruth stood slowly, her medical bag still open beside Billy's bed. Around the room, the gathered miners and their wives watched with the fascination of people witnessing an execution. Only Mary Ellen moved, stepping closer to Ruth in a gesture of solidarity that would likely cost her dearly. "The boy needed immediate treatment," Ruth said, though she knew the explanation would change nothing. "His fever was approaching dangerous levels. What the boy needed," Cray replied, "was for you to follow established procedure. What this town needed was a nurse who understood her place." Mrs. Hendricks clutched her son's hand, tears streaming down her weathered face. She understood, as they all did, that Ruth's dismissal would leave Black Hollow without medical care until another nurse could be found and convinced to take the position. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away over mountain roads that became impassable in winter weather. Samuel. The voice belonged to an older man who had remained silent until now, someone whose presence commanded immediate attention from the others. Ruth recognized him from the brief descriptions in her correspondence. James Carver, owner of the Carver Mining Company and employer of every family in Black Hollow. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Cray's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward the door. "Everyone out. This is company business now." The room emptied except for Ruth, Mrs. Hendricks, and the sleeping child. Through the thin walls, Ruth could hear low voices on the porch, could feel the weight of decisions being made without her input. She used the time to check Billy's pulse and temperature, noting improvements that justified her intervention even as she prepared for whatever judgment awaited. When the door reopened, only Cray and Carver entered. The mine owner was smaller than Ruth had expected, his expensive suit incongruous in the humble cottage. But his eyes held the kind of calculation that had built fortunes from mountain stone and human sweat. "Miss Brennan," Carver began, his voice carrying educated tones that set him apart from every other man in Black Hollow. "Your medical credentials are impressive. Dr. Henley spoke highly of your work in Pittsburgh." Ruth waited, understanding that praise from men like Carver always came with conditions attached. "However," Carver continued, "your disregard for established authority creates problems. The success of this community depends on clear chains of command, on workers and professionals who understand their roles." "My role is to provide medical care," Ruth replied, though she kept her voice respectful. "The boy was seriously ill. The boy is company property," Cray interjected harshly. "His father works for us. His family lives in company housing. Their medical care is provided through company channels. You don't get to decide what's best for company property." The brutal calculus of the statement hit Ruth like a physical blow. In Pittsburgh, she had dealt with poverty and desperation, but she had never encountered a system that so explicitly reduced human beings to economic assets. Billy Hendricks wasn't a sick child in need of care. He was damaged inventory that required proper procedures for repair. Carver raised a hand, silencing Cray's anger. "What Sam means is that we have systems in place for good reasons. Medical decisions affect productivity, insurance claims, worker morale. One nurse making independent choices can disrupt carefully balanced arrangements." Ruth began to understand the deeper game being played around her. Her defiance wasn't just about medical protocol, it was about the fundamental power structure that kept Black Hollow functioning. If she could ignore Cray's authority in medical matters, what would stop miners from questioning his decisions about safety, working conditions, or wages? "I see the dilemma," Ruth said carefully, "but I also see the contradiction. You need medical care for your workers, but you don't trust medical professionals to make medical decisions." "We trust medical professionals who understand local conditions," Carver replied. "Which brings me to my proposal." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. A proposal meant negotiation, meant she might not be on tomorrow morning's bus after all. But she also sensed that whatever Carver offered would come with a price that might prove higher than simple dismissal. "You'll remain as company nurse," Carver continued, "with full authority to provide emergency medical care. No prior approval required, no paperwork delays." The offer was more than Ruth had dared hope for. Medical autonomy that would let her serve the community without constant battles over procedure. But Carver's expression told her the real terms were yet to come. "In exchange," he said, "you'll sign a contract specifying certain obligations beyond normal medical duties. Community involvement, shall we say." Ruth's medical training had taught her to recognize symptoms, to read the signs that indicated deeper problems beneath surface presentations. Carver's careful phrasing triggered every warning instinct she possessed. Community involvement could mean anything from social obligations to activities that compromised medical ethics. "What kind of involvement?" she asked. "Nothing that conflicts with your medical responsibilities," Carver assured her. "Occasionally, certain information comes to light during medical examinations. Worker health issues, family problems, concerns about loyalty or stability. Sometimes that information is valuable to company decision-making." The true price of medical autonomy became clear. Carver wasn't offering her freedom to practice medicine. He was recruiting her as an informant, asking her to violate patient confidentiality in service of corporate interests. Every examination would become an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Every confidence shared in pain or desperation would become potential ammunition in the company's efforts to control its workforce. Ruth looked at Billy Hendricks, still sleeping peacefully under the influence of her morphine. His recovery would depend on continued care, on access to medications and monitoring that only she could provide. Mrs. Hendricks watched from the corner, her face showing desperate hope that the new nurse might be allowed to stay. "I need time to consider your offer," Ruth said finally. "You have until morning," Carver replied. "The bus leaves at 7 whether you're on it or not." After the men left, Ruth remained at Billy's bedside while his mother prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The fever had broken, but the boy's breathing still carried troubling undertones that suggested complications she couldn't diagnose without proper equipment. He would need careful monitoring, possibly hospitalization if his condition worsened. Mary Ellen appeared at the door as darkness settled over Black Hollow, carrying news from the company store and the other cottages. Word of the confrontation had spread through the community like wildfire, and opinions were sharply divided. Some families saw Ruth as a troublemaker whose defiance would bring unwanted attention from management. Others whispered that maybe it was time someone stood up to the system that treated them like property. "Carver made you an offer," Mary Ellen said. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a town this small. "He did," Ruth confirmed. "Medical autonomy in exchange for information." Mary Ellen's expression darkened. "The last nurse they tried that with lasted 2 weeks before she couldn't stand it anymore. Packed up in the middle of the night and never looked back." Ruth felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The quick turnover of medical staff, the strange emphasis on authority and procedure, the way Carver had been ready with his proposal. She wasn't the first nurse to face this choice, and she wouldn't be the last. "What kind of information did they want?" Ruth asked. "Everything," Mary Ellen replied. "Who was talking about organizing, which families were having money troubles, who might be planning to leave for work in other towns." They wanted her to be eyes and ears in every house she entered. The scope of the surveillance network became clear. A nurse's position provided access to intimate family details, to moments of vulnerability when people might reveal thoughts and plans they would never share publicly. Carver's offer wasn't just about medical information. It was about creating a comprehensive intelligence operation disguised as healthcare. Ruth spent the evening walking Black Hollow's narrow streets, trying to understand the community she was being asked to spy upon. The town felt smaller in darkness, more isolated, as if the mountains had moved closer to press against the company houses and mining facilities. Lamplight flickered in windows, revealing glimpses of families gathered around kitchen tables. Children doing homework by kerosene flame, women mending clothes that would have to last another season. These people needed medical care desperately. She had seen it in Billy's fever, in the coal dust that lined every throat, in the way men moved with the careful stiffness of backs and joints damaged by years underground. But they also needed privacy, needed to know that their doctor-patient relationships weren't being monitored and reported to management. At the edge of town, Ruth found herself standing before a small cemetery that climbed the hillside in irregular terraces. Even in darkness, she could see that many of the graves were recent, marked with simple wooden crosses that bore mining company numbers instead of names. The message was unmistakable. This was where workers ended up when they became too damaged or troublesome to remain useful. Thinking about the old burial ground? The voice belonged to an elderly man she hadn't met, someone whose weathered face and bent posture marked him as a retired miner. That's where the trouble started, according to some. Ruth turned, grateful for the distraction from her dark thoughts. What kind of trouble? Strange sickness started about 6 months ago. Miners coming up from the deep shafts with fever and lung troubles that don't match anything the doctor's ever seen. Some folks say it started when they opened that new tunnel, the one that cuts through the old Cherokee burial sites. The man's words sent a chill through Ruth that had nothing to do with mountain air. Billy's symptoms, the fever, the respiratory distress, his strange mention of stones in his chest, suddenly took on new significance. What if his illness wasn't an isolated case? What if other children were showing similar symptoms? "How many miners have gotten sick?" Ruth asked. "Dozens so far, maybe more. Company's been keeping it quiet, sending the worst cases to hospitals in Charleston, but word gets around." Ruth's medical mind began processing possibilities. An outbreak of unknown illness, symptoms that didn't match standard diagnoses, a pattern that suggested environmental exposure rather than contagion. If children like Billy were beginning to show similar symptoms, the implications were staggering. Has anyone else reported children getting sick? The old man studied her carefully. You asking as the company nurse or as someone who might actually care about the answer? The question struck to the heart of her dilemma. Tomorrow morning, she would choose between medical independence purchased with moral compromise or ethical integrity that would leave Black Hollow without health care. But tonight, she was simply a nurse who had encountered a sick child with symptoms that might represent something far more dangerous than anyone realized. I'm asking as someone who gave a 5-year-old boy morphine because he was in pain, Ruth replied. Whatever that makes me. The old man smiled, the first genuine smile Ruth had seen since arriving in Black Hollow. That makes you someone worth talking to. Name's Thomas Whitehawk. My grandson lives 3 streets over from the Hendricks place. Started running fever yesterday. Ruth felt her blood turn cold. 2 children with similar symptoms, both living near the mining district. If this was the beginning of an outbreak, every hour of delay could mean more victims. I need to see him, Ruth said. Company rules say you need authorization, Thomas reminded her. Ruth thought about Carver's offer, about the price of medical autonomy and the cost of ethical compromise. Then she thought about Billy Hendricks sleeping peacefully under the influence of her morphine, and about another child somewhere in Black Hollow who might be lying awake in pain because she was too concerned about politics to provide care. Company rules say a lot of things, Ruth replied. Some of them are going to have to bend. As they walked back toward town, Thomas shared more details about the mysterious illness affecting the miners. The symptoms were consistent: fever, respiratory distress, and a peculiar weakness that seemed to affect judgment and coordination. But what troubled him most was the pattern of onset, the way the sickness seemed to follow the opening of new tunnel sections that cut deeper into the mountain than any previous mining had attempted. Cherokee used to say this mountain was sacred, Thomas explained. Said there were things buried here that should stay buried. Most folks figured that was just superstition. Ruth found herself thinking about Billy's strange words. Stones in my chest, heavy stones. If the illness was related to the mining operation, if something in the deeper tunnels was causing these symptoms, then every day of continued work was putting more people at risk. They reached Thomas's grandson's house just as the boy's fever spiked, his small body convulsing with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. Ruth administered what care she could with her limited supplies, but she knew both children needed more comprehensive treatment than she could provide in company housing. They need to be hospitalized, she told the gathered family members, both boys, as soon as possible. Company won't approve hospital costs for children, Thomas said grimly. Not unless they're dying. Ruth realized she had found her answer to Carver's ultimatum. Medical autonomy meant nothing if it only extended to cases the company found financially acceptable. True health care required the authority to make difficult decisions, to advocate for patients regardless of economic considerations. As dawn approached, Ruth walked back to her clinic to prepare for the 7 o'clock confrontation. She would reject Carver's offer, would accept dismissal rather than compromise her medical ethics. But she would also document everything she had observed about the mysterious illness, would find a way to ensure that someone continued investigating even after she was gone. The bus was already waiting when Carver and Cray arrived at the clinic, its engine idling in the crisp morning air. Ruth had packed her few belongings, had written detailed notes about Billy Hendricks and the other sick child for whoever might replace her. But she had also hidden copies of those notes, had made arrangements with Mary Ellen to smuggle information about the outbreak to authorities outside Black Hollow's corporate control. Well, Miss Brennan, Carver asked, have you made your decision? Ruth met his gaze steadily, her trembling hand somehow steady as she prepared for the consequences of her choice. I have. The answer is no. But as she moved toward the bus, Carver's voice stopped her with words that changed everything. That's unfortunate, especially since 3 more children took sick during the night, including Mary Ellen's youngest. Ruth's hand froze on the bus door handle as Carver's words sank in. 3 more children, including Mary Ellen's youngest, a girl of barely 4 years whose laughter had brightened the previous evening's darkness. The pattern was accelerating, spreading beyond the mining families to affect anyone living near the extraction sites. "You're lying," Ruth said, though she could see in Carver's eyes that he wasn't. "Check for yourself," he replied, gesturing toward the town. "But understand that every minute you spend on that bus is a minute those children don't get medical attention." The manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to exploit Ruth's medical conscience while cornering her into accepting his original offer. But as she looked past Carver toward Black Hollow's narrow streets, Ruth saw Mary Ellen running toward them, her face streaked with tears and desperate panic. "Ruth!" Mary Ellen called out, ignoring the presence of the mine owner and foreman. "Please, it's Jenny." "She can't breathe right. Keeps talking about stones like Billy did. Mama's with her now, but she's getting worse." Ruth dropped her bag and stepped away from the bus, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. She couldn't leave, not with children's lives at stake. But accepting Carver's terms would mean becoming part of a system that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage. "I need to examine all the affected children," Ruth said to Carver. "Immediately." "Of course," he replied smoothly. "As soon as we formalize our arrangement." Ruth understood the trap perfectly now. Carver had orchestrated this moment, had waited until the crisis reached a point where she would have no choice but to accept his terms. The outbreak wasn't an unfortunate coincidence. It was leverage, human lives used as bargaining chips in corporate negotiations. "There won't be any arrangement," Ruth said firmly. "I'll treat the children as a medical emergency, but I won't spy on families for your company." Cray stepped forward, his expression darkening. "You don't get to dictate terms here, lady. This is company property, company workers, company rules." "These are sick children," Ruth shot back, her voice carrying across the morning air loud enough for other early risers to hear. "Not company property." The public nature of the confrontation added new weight to every word. Windows opened along the street as people emerged to witness the standoff between their potential medical care and the authority that governed their lives. Ruth realized she was fighting more than a contract negotiation. She was challenging the fundamental assumptions that kept Black Hollow's social order intact. Carver seemed to recognize the dangerous shift in dynamics. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private," he suggested. "No," Ruth replied, raising her voice deliberately. "If you want to negotiate with children's lives, let everyone hear what you're proposing." Mary Ellen moved closer to Ruth, her presence offering support that emboldened others. Thomas Whitehawk appeared from between 2 houses, his grandson's condition having worsened during the night. Other families began emerging, drawn by the commotion and their desperate need for medical answers. "The new nurse wants to help our children," Mary Ellen announced to the gathering crowd. "But they're saying she has to spy on us first." Murmurs rippled through the assembled workers and wives, voices carrying anger and desperation in equal measure. Ruth saw Cray's hand move instinctively toward the radio clipped to his belt, ready to call for security or law enforcement if the situation deteriorated further. "That's enough," Carver said sharply. "Everyone back to your homes. This is private business." But the crowd didn't disperse. If anything, more people appeared, including several miners who should have been preparing for their morning shift. Ruth realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in Black Hollow, a moment when the community's need outweighed their fear of management retribution. "How many children are sick?" Ruth called out to the crowd, bypassing Carver's authority entirely. 7, Thomas Whitehawk replied. "Maybe more by now. All with fever and breathing problems?" "And the stone talk," added another voice. "Every one of them talking about sties in their chest." Ruth's medical mind processed the implications rapidly. 7 children with identical symptoms suggested either a contagious outbreak or environmental exposure. Given the mining context and the strange specificity of the stone references, environmental causes seemed more likely, but that would implicate the company's operations directly. "I need to examine them all," Ruth announced. "Anyone who wants their child seen, bring them to the clinic." "You don't have authority to treat anyone," Cray interjected angrily. Ruth turned to face him directly, her voice carrying the authority she had learned in Pittsburgh emergency rooms. I have medical training and moral obligation. That's all the authority I need. The confrontation had reached a breaking point. Carver could order Ruth's arrest, could have security forces remove her bodily. But doing so in front of the entire community would create exactly the kind of public disturbance that mining companies worked hard to avoid. Bad publicity could bring outside attention, regulatory investigations, questions about worker safety that no company wanted to answer. Fine, Carver said finally. Examine the children, but understand that any medical treatment requires proper authorization and documentation. Ruth nodded, accepting the compromise while planning to ignore its restrictions the moment a child's life was in danger. She gathered her medical bag and started toward the clinic, followed by a procession of worried parents carrying fevered children. The next 3 hours revealed the scope of the crisis. 7 children between the ages of 3 and 8, all presenting identical symptoms that didn't match any standard childhood illness Ruth had encountered. The fever patterns were wrong, the respiratory distress too severe, and the consistent reports of chest pain described as stones suggested something far more serious than typical childhood ailments. But it was Jenny, Mary Ellen's youngest, who provided the crucial clue. As Ruth examined the little girl's chest, listening to the abnormal sounds in her lungs, Jenny grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "The mountain is angry," Jenny whispered, her fevered eyes unusually bright. "Grandpa Cherokee told me in my dream. They broke the sleeping stones." Ruth exchanged glances with Mary Ellen, both women recognizing that Jenny had never had any contact with Cherokee culture or beliefs. Yet her words echoed Thomas Whitehawk's warnings about sacred burial sites and things that should remain buried. "What did Grandpa Cherokee tell you about the stones?" Ruth asked gently. "They're not supposed to wake up," Jenny replied. "But the digging woke them up, and now they're angry. They want to go back to sleep, but they can't find their way." The child's words sent a chill through everyone present. Whether Jenny's fever dreams represented genuine supernatural contact or simply reflected community anxieties about the mining operation, her description suggested that the illness might be connected to the company's recent expansion into previously untouched areas of the mountain. Ruth spent the afternoon researching everything she could find about the geological composition of the local mountains, using the limited resources available in the clinic and company offices. What she discovered made her increasingly convinced that the children's illness was environmental rather than infectious. The mountain contained unusual mineral deposits, including several rare earth elements that had only recently become economically viable to extract. The new mining techniques required deeper tunnels and more aggressive extraction methods, potentially disturbing geological formations that had been stable for centuries. But the real breakthrough came when Thomas Whitehawk appeared at the clinic near evening, carrying a small cloth bag that he handled with obvious reverence. "Found this in my grandson's room," he said, carefully unwrapping the contents. "Don't know how it got there, but it appeared the same night he took sick." Inside the cloth was a stone unlike anything Ruth had ever seen. It was perfectly spherical, about the size of a child's fist, with a surface that seemed to shift and shimmer in the lamplight. But what struck her most forcefully was the way it felt wrong somehow, as if it carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. "There are more," Thomas continued. "Other families found them too, always in the children's rooms, always appearing the night the fever started." Ruth stared at the stone, her scientific training warring with instincts that screamed warnings she couldn't rationally explain. If similar objects had appeared in connection with each case of illness, they represented either an incredible coincidence or evidence of something beyond her medical understanding. "Have any adults touched these stones directly?" she asked. "Few tried," Thomas replied. "Most got sick within hours, nothing like what the children have, but sick enough to know better than to handle them again." The implications were staggering. If the stones were somehow connected to the illness, if they had emerged from the newly opened mining tunnels, then the company's operations weren't just disturbing geological formations. They were releasing something that posed a direct threat to human health. Ruth wrapped the stone carefully and secured it in her medical bag, planning to arrange for proper analysis as soon as possible. But as evening approached, she faced a more immediate crisis. The children's conditions were worsening, and several needed hospitalization that the company would never approve. That was when Mary Ellen returned to the clinic with news that changed everything. "They're evacuating the deep tunnels," she reported breathlessly. "Something happened down there this afternoon." Miners came up talking about voices in the rock, about stones that moved on their own. Companies sealed off the whole section. Ruth felt pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. The mining operation had disturbed something in the deep mountain, something connected to the mysterious stones and the children's illness. The company knew about the danger. Their evacuation of the tunnels proved it. But they were keeping the information secret while children suffered from exposure to whatever had been released. "We need to get those children to a hospital," Ruth said. "All of them, tonight." "Company won't authorize transport," Mary Ellen replied. "Carver says it's too expensive for undiagnosed conditions." Ruth understood that she had reached another moment of choice. The company's refusal to provide proper medical care wasn't just negligence. It was a cover-up, an attempt to hide evidence of their culpability in the outbreak. Every hour those children remained in Black Hollow was another hour of exposure to whatever was making them sick. But challenging the company's medical authority would mean open rebellion, a confrontation that could result in her arrest and the complete loss of any ability to help the affected families. She needed a different approach, something that would bypass corporate control while getting the children the care they needed. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Ruth debated her options, Carver himself appeared at the clinic, his usual composure replaced by obvious anxiety. "Miss Brennan," he began, "there's been a development that changes our situation somewhat." Ruth waited, sensing that the corporate executive was about to reveal information he would prefer to keep hidden. "The state health department has received reports about unusual illness patterns in mining communities," Carver continued reluctantly. "They're sending investigators tomorrow morning." The news hit Ruth like a revelation. Someone had bypassed the company's information control, had alerted outside authorities about the outbreak. The investigators would have authority that superseded corporate policies, would demand access to all medical records and patient information. "I see," Ruth said carefully. "And you want me to ensure that those records present the situation in the most favorable light possible." Carver's expression confirmed her suspicions. The company needed her cooperation to manage the narrative, to present the outbreak as an unfortunate coincidence rather than evidence of negligent mining practices. "The investigators will want to interview all affected families," Carver said. "Your medical opinions will carry significant weight in their assessment." Ruth realized she finally held leverage in their ongoing negotiation. The state investigation would proceed regardless of her cooperation, but her testimony could determine whether it resulted in minor safety citations or criminal charges for endangering community health. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Ruth said. "Present the facts objectively," Carver replied. "Don't speculate about causes beyond your medical expertise." The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but Ruth understood the implications. She was being asked to limit her testimony to clinical observations while ignoring the obvious connections between the mining operation and the children's illness. "And in exchange, full medical authority," Carver said. "Immediate hospital transport for any children you deem necessary, unlimited supplies, complete autonomy in treatment decisions." The offer was everything Ruth had wanted since arriving in Black Hollow, genuine medical independence without the compromise of becoming a company informant. But it came at the cost of silence about the true causes of the outbreak, complicity in a cover-up that could affect other mining communities facing similar threats. Ruth looked around the clinic, thinking about the 7 children whose lives hung in the balance. Jenny's fevered words echoed in her memory. "They want to go back to sleep, but they can't find their way." Whatever was happening in Black Hollow, it was bigger than one community's medical crisis. Other mining towns, other children, could face the same danger if the truth remained hidden. "I need tonight to consider your offer," Ruth said finally. Carver nodded, though his expression suggested he understood her hesitation represented something more dangerous than simple negotiation. The investigators arrive at 8 tomorrow morning. I'll need your decision before then. After Carver left, Ruth sat alone in the clinic as darkness settled over Black Hollow. The mysterious stone seemed to pulse with its own light in the lamp glow, and she found herself thinking about Jenny's dreams of angry mountains and displaced spirits seeking rest. Whether the outbreak had supernatural causes or purely scientific explanations, the fundamental question remained the same. Was she willing to trade silence for the power to save lives? Or would she risk everything to expose a truth that might protect others but could destroy her ability to help the children already suffering? Outside, the mountain loomed against the stars, and Ruth could swear she heard something moving in the deep tunnels below. A sound like stones shifting in their ancient sleep, seeking a rest that mining operations had forever disturbed. Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of children crying. Not the normal fussing of restless sleep, but the deep, painful wails of serious illness. Through her boarding house window, she could see lights flickering in houses throughout Black Hollow as families struggled with worsening conditions. The mysterious fever had spread to 12 children now, and their symptoms were intensifying despite her limited treatments. She dressed quickly and made her way to the clinic, where she found Mary Ellen waiting with Jenny wrapped in blankets. The little girl's condition had deteriorated overnight. Her breathing shallow and labored, her fevered whispers now incoherent streams of Cherokee words that neither she nor her mother had ever learned. "She started speaking at around midnight," Mary Ellen explained, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "Words I don't understand, but they sound like prayers. Like she's begging for something." Ruth examined Jenny carefully, noting the alarming changes in her vital signs. The child's pulse was rapid and weak, her temperature dangerously high, and her lung sounds suggested fluid accumulation that could prove fatal without immediate intervention. All 7 of the original cases were showing similar deterioration, and Ruth knew with sickening certainty that she was losing them. "We have to get her to Charleston," Ruth said. "Tonight. She won't survive another 12 hours without proper hospital care." "Company says no transport without state authorization," Mary Ellen replied bitterly. "They're waiting for those investigators to make the decision." Ruth felt anger building in her chest, a white-hot fury at the bureaucratic callousness that prioritized corporate liability over children's lives. The state investigators wouldn't arrive for 3 more hours, and by then Jenny and the others might be beyond medical help. "Then we don't wait for company approval," Ruth said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised them both. Mary Ellen stared at her. "What do you mean?" "Thomas Whitehawk has a truck. If we can get the children to the main highway, I can flag down traffic, get them rides to Charleston. The hospital will have to treat them once they arrive." "That's kidnapping," Mary Ellen whispered. "Taking company property off company land without authorization." The brutal terminology hit Ruth like a slap. Even Mary Ellen, fighting desperately to save her daughter's life, had internalized the corporate mindset that reduced human beings to property classifications. But Ruth also heard something else in the woman's voice. A desperate hope that someone might finally be willing to challenge the system that was letting their children die. "It's medical evacuation," Ruth corrected firmly, "and I'll take full responsibility." They spent the next hour moving carefully through Black Hollow's pre-dawn darkness, gathering the sickest children from their families. Not all parents were willing to risk company retaliation, but 6 families agreed to trust Ruth's judgment over corporate policy. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, they had assembled a convoy of makeshift ambulances, Thomas's truck, 2 borrowed cars, and a mining cart pressed into service. Ruth had sedated the children to ease their suffering during transport, using precious medical supplies that she would never be able to replace. But as they prepared to leave, Samuel Cray appeared at the head of a group of company security guards, his face dark with anger and authority. "Nobody leaves company property without proper authorization," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered families. "Return those children to their homes immediately." Ruth stood between Cray and the vehicles, her medical bag clutched in her trembling hand. Behind her, she could hear Jenny's labored breathing, could feel the weight of 6 other young lives depending on her courage. "These children are dying," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "They need immediate hospitalization. They need to follow proper procedures, Cray shot back. Company policy exists for good reasons. Company policy is killing them, Ruth replied, loud enough for everyone to hear, and I won't stand by and watch. The confrontation drew more observers as early shift miners and their families emerged to see what was happening. Ruth realized she was creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that Carver had wanted to avoid, but she no longer cared about corporate sensibilities. 6 children were dying, and no amount of bureaucratic authority could justify letting that happen. "Stand aside, Miss Brennan," Cray ordered. Last warning. Ruth looked at the security guards flanking Cray, at the weapons on their belts, at the absolute authority they represented in Black Hollow's isolated world. Then she looked at the vehicles behind her, at the parents whose trust she carried, at the children whose lives hung in the balance. "No," she said simply. Cray's hand moved toward his radio, but before he could call for backup, a new voice cut through the morning air. "What seems to be the problem here?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 50s, wearing a business suit and carrying credentials that identified her as Dr. Patricia Morrison from the State Health Department. The investigators had arrived early, drawn by reports that had reached them during the night. Ruth felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by the understanding that the real confrontation was just beginning. Dr. Morrison's presence changed the political dynamics, but it also meant that Ruth's actions would now be scrutinized by state authorities, who might view her evacuation attempt as evidence of dangerous judgment. "Dr. Morrison," Cray said, his tone shifting to professional courtesy. "We weren't expecting you until 8 o'clock. Reports of seriously ill children tend to accelerate our schedules, Doctor," Morrison replied dryly. "I trust you won't object to my examining the patients immediately." Cray's jaw tightened, but he couldn't refuse a state official's direct request. "Of course. Miss Brennan has been treating them according to company protocols." Ruth caught the subtle misdirection in Cray's words, the attempt to make her actions appear sanctioned by corporate authority. But Dr. Morrison was already moving toward the vehicles, her trained eyes taking in the severity of the children's conditions. "These children need immediate hospitalization, Doctor," Morrison said after a quick assessment. "Why haven't they been transported?" "We were waiting for proper authorization," Cray replied. Company policy doesn't supersede medical necessity, Doctor." Morrison cut him off sharply. "These children should have been hospitalized hours ago." Ruth felt vindication wash over her, followed by the sobering realization that her evacuation attempt had probably saved lives. Without the early arrival of state investigators, the children might have deteriorated beyond help while company officials debated procedures. "I was preparing to transport them when Mr. Cray intervened," Ruth said carefully, threading the needle between honesty and diplomacy. Dr. Morrison's expression suggested she understood the political complexities perfectly. "Well, there's no intervention needed now. I'm ordering immediate medical evacuation under state health emergency protocols." The convoy left Black Hollow within 30 minutes, racing along mountain roads that seemed to stretch endlessly toward Charleston. Ruth rode with Jenny, monitoring the little girl's vital signs and administering what care she could in the cramped confines of Thomas's truck. Behind them, the other vehicles carried their precious cargo of sick children whose survival now depended on reaching proper medical facilities in time. But even as they descended from the mountains toward the valley hospitals, Ruth knew that the real battle was just beginning. Dr. Morrison had made it clear that a full investigation would follow, one that would examine not just the medical aspects of the outbreak, but the corporate policies that had delayed treatment. Ruth's testimony would be crucial in determining whether anyone would be held accountable for the children's suffering. The Charleston Hospital's emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as 7 critically ill children arrived simultaneously. Ruth worked alongside the hospital staff, providing medical histories and treatment records, while watching her small patients receive the intensive care they desperately needed. Jenny was placed on a ventilator, her breathing supported by machines that Black Hollow's clinic could never have provided. It was during the 3rd hour of treatment that Dr. Morrison found Ruth in the hospital corridor, her expression grim with new understanding. "We need to talk, Doctor," Morrison said, gesturing toward a private consultation room, What you're about to hear doesn't leave this room until we decide how to proceed." Ruth followed the state official into the small room, her exhaustion making everything feel surreal and fragmented. Through the window, she could see Black Hollow's mountains in the distance, their peaks shrouded in morning mist that looked almost like smoke. "The preliminary blood tests show something unprecedented, Doctor," Morrison began. "These children have been exposed to a radioactive isotope that doesn't exist in nature. It's artificially created, produced only under very specific industrial conditions." Ruth felt the world shift around her as the implications became clear. The mysterious stones, the strange illness, the company's desperate attempts to control information. It all pointed to something far more serious than mining accidents or environmental contamination. "Are you saying the company created this substance?" Ruth asked. "I'm saying someone did, Doctor," Morrison replied carefully. "And given the proximity to the mining operation, along with the timing of the outbreak, there are questions that need answers." Ruth thought about Carver's offer from the previous night, his desperate desire to control her testimony to the investigators. The company's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't just trying to avoid liability for negligence. They were trying to hide evidence of something that could result in criminal charges. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. "Now we document everything, Doctor," Morrison said. "Every symptom, every timeline, every corporate decision that delayed treatment. And then we decide whether this was criminal negligence or something worse." The consultation room door opened suddenly, admitting a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of federal law enforcement. Ruth recognized the type immediately from her Pittsburgh days, someone whose presence meant that local problems had become matters of national security. "Dr. Morrison," the man said, his voice carrying unmistakable command. "Agent Collins, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we need to discuss your findings immediately." Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. The involvement of federal nuclear authorities meant that the Black Hollow outbreak was connected to something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The mining company wasn't just extracting coal and rare earth elements. They were apparently involved in activities that posed threats serious enough to warrant nuclear regulatory oversight. "Miss Brennan," Agent Collins continued, his attention focusing on Ruth with uncomfortable intensity. "Your medical records and testimony will be crucial to our investigation. I trust you understand the sensitivity of the situation." Ruth understood perfectly. She was being warned that her testimony could affect matters of national importance, that the wrong words could have consequences extending far beyond Black Hollow's corporate politics. The pressure she had felt from Carver was nothing compared to the weight of federal authority now settling around her. "The children are my primary concern," Ruth said carefully. "Everything else is secondary." "Of course," Collins replied, though his tone suggested that he found her priorities naive. "But you should understand that your medical observations may have implications for national security. Certain details might need to be classified for the public good." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ruth's testimony could be suppressed, her findings buried under layers of federal classification that would prevent any public accountability. The children might receive medical care, but the truth about what had endangered them could disappear into bureaucratic secrecy. Ruth looked out the window toward Black Hollow's distant mountains, thinking about Jenny's fevered words about angry stones and displaced spirits. Whether the outbreak had supernatural origins or purely scientific explanations, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Powerful institutions were more concerned with protecting themselves than protecting the people they had harmed. "I need to check on my patients," Ruth said, standing to leave. Agent Collins' voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Brennan, I hope you'll give careful thought to how you discuss these events. Some truths are too dangerous for public consumption." Ruth met his gaze steadily, her trembling hand somehow steady as she prepared her response. "And some lies are too dangerous for private protection." She left the consultation room knowing that she had just declared war against forces more powerful than she had ever imagined. But as she returned to Jenny's bedside, watching machines breathe for the little girl who had trusted her with fevered whispers about mountain spirits, Ruth knew she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. The real battle for Black Hollow's children was just beginning, and the stakes had become higher than anyone could have anticipated. The hospital corridor felt like a battlefield as Ruth returned from her confrontation with Agent Collins. 3 days had passed since the children's evacuation, and their conditions had stabilized enough to reveal the true scope of what they faced. The radioactive isotope in their bloodstreams wasn't diminishing as expected. If anything, the readings suggested continued exposure to a source that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Morrison found Ruth beside Jenny's bed, where the little girl had begun speaking again, though her words remained a mixture of English and Cherokee phrases that seemed to flow from some deep ancestral memory. "The federal team wants to move the children to a classified medical facility, Doctor," Morrison said quietly. "They're claiming it's for specialized treatment, but I think we both know what this really means." Ruth understood immediately. Once the children disappeared into federal custody, their cases would vanish from public record. No independent doctors would monitor their progress. No journalists would investigate their origins. No accountability would ever emerge for whatever had poisoned them in the first place. "Over my dead body," Ruth said, her voice carrying steel that surprised both women. "Ruth, these are federal agents. They have authority we can't challenge." "They have authority over nuclear materials and national security," Ruth corrected. "They don't have authority over my patients. These children were poisoned in Black Hollow, and they deserve medical care from doctors who answer to medical ethics, not government classification systems." Dr. Morrison looked around nervously, aware that their conversation could be overheard by the federal agents stationed throughout the hospital. "What are you proposing?" Ruth had spent the sleepless nights since the evacuation, thinking about exactly that question. The federal involvement proved that the Black Hollow situation was connected to something much larger than mining accidents. But it also meant that conventional channels for justice and accountability were being systematically blocked. "We document everything," Ruth said. "Medical records, treatment protocols, recovery progress. We create a paper trail that can't be classified or disappeared. And then what? Then we make sure the right people see it." Ruth had already begun implementing her plan, working with sympathetic hospital staff to create duplicate medical files that could be smuggled out if the children were transferred to federal custody. But she also knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. The real power lay in testimony, in eyewitness accounts that could connect the children's suffering to the corporate and government agencies responsible. That afternoon brought news that changed everything. Mary Ellen appeared at the hospital, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with determined anger. "They're shutting down Black Hollow," she reported. "Federal order. Everyone has to evacuate within 72 hours. Ruth felt her blood run cold. Mass evacuation would scatter the community, making it impossible to gather testimony or build a case for accountability. Families would be relocated to different towns, children separated from their medical histories, witnesses dispersed across multiple states where their individual stories could be more easily dismissed or discredited. "What's the official reason?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Geological instability," Mary Ellen replied bitterly. "They're saying the mining operation destabilized underground formations, created cave-in risks. No mention of sick children or radioactive materials. The cover story was expertly crafted, providing a plausible explanation for evacuation while avoiding any acknowledgement of the health crisis. Future investigations would find empty buildings and scattered families, with no coherent narrative to challenge official accounts." "Where are they relocating people?" Ruth asked. "Different places. Some families to Kentucky, others to Tennessee. They're making sure nobody ends up in the same town." Mary Ellen's voice carried the weight of understanding what this meant. "They're breaking us apart, so we can't compare stories." Ruth realized she was witnessing a masterclass in institutional damage control. The federal response wasn't designed to help the affected families. It was designed to eliminate their ability to organize, to bear witness, to demand justice for what had been done to their children. "We have 48 hours, Ruth said, her mind racing through possibilities. 48 hours to document everything, get testimony from as many families as possible, and create a record that can't be suppressed. Dr. Morrison shook her head. "Ruth, you're talking about challenging federal authority. These people have resources and power you can't imagine. And I have 7 poisoned children whose only advocate is a nurse with a trembling hand, Ruth replied. But sometimes that's enough. The next 24 hours became a frantic race against time and authority. Ruth worked with Mary Ellen and Thomas Whitehawk to contact scattered family members, gathering medical histories and personal accounts before the evacuation scattered everyone beyond reach. They met in secret, in hospital corridors and parking lots, sharing information that could cost them all dearly if discovered. The testimonies revealed a pattern more disturbing than Ruth had imagined. The mysterious stones hadn't appeared randomly. They had been systematically placed in specific homes, targeting families whose breadwinners worked in the deepest mining tunnels. The placement suggested deliberate distribution rather than accidental exposure, as if someone had been conducting an experiment on Black Hollow's population. It was a test, Thomas Whitehawk concluded during one of their clandestine meetings. They were testing something on us, using our children as lab rats. The accusation was almost too monstrous to believe. But the evidence supported it, the controlled exposure patterns, the careful documentation of symptoms, the immediate federal response when outside investigators arrived. Everything pointed to a deliberate study of radioactive materials' effects on human subjects. Ruth found herself thinking about the Tuskegee experiments, about other historical cases where government agencies had used vulnerable populations for medical research without consent or safety protections. The precedents existed. The institutional capacity was proven, and the isolation of Black Hollow would have made it an ideal testing ground. But understanding the scope of the conspiracy also revealed the magnitude of the forces arrayed against them. If federal agencies were willing to poison children for research purposes, they would certainly be willing to silence anyone who threatened to expose that research. The crisis came to a head during Ruth's final night in the hospital, as she maintained vigil beside Jenny's bed. The little girl had been conscious for several hours, speaking in clear English for the first time since her fever broke. "Miss Ruth," Jenny whispered, her small hand gripping Ruth's with surprising strength. "The mountain spirits are going back to sleep. They're not angry anymore." "Why aren't they angry, sweetheart?" Ruth asked gently. "Because someone finally heard them. Someone finally listened when they tried to warn us." Jenny's fevered eyes held unusual clarity. "They said to tell you, the stones remember everything. Even when people forget, the stones remember." Ruth felt a chill of understanding. If Jenny's words held more than fever dreams, if there was some connection between the mysterious stones and the radioactive exposure, then physical evidence might exist that could corroborate their testimonies. "Jenny, do you know where the stones came from?" "The deep place," the child replied, "where the old ones are buried. The mining men dug too deep, broke the sleeping place. That's when the stones woke up and started looking for new homes." Ruth realized that Jenny was describing the geological disruption that had released the radioactive materials. But she was describing it in spiritual terms that connected the scientific reality to Cherokee beliefs about sacred burial sites and disturbed spirits. The fusion of supernatural explanation and scientific fact provided a narrative framework that could make the complex technical details accessible to public understanding. Ruth began to see how the community's traditional stories could serve as a bridge between the sterile language of federal reports and the human reality of children's suffering. Agent Collins appeared at the hospital room door, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere toward a confrontation. "Miss Brennan, we need to discuss your plans for tonight." Ruth stood slowly, positioning herself between the federal agent and Jenny's bed. "My plans involve monitoring my patient's recovery." "Your patient is being transferred to specialized federal care in the morning," Collins replied, "as are all the affected children, classified medical facility, specially trained staff." "Over my medical objection," Ruth stated clearly, ensuring that her protest would be on record. "Your objection is noted. But national security considerations supersede individual medical preferences." Ruth understood that this was her last opportunity to create an official record of her opposition. Once the children were transferred to federal custody, all documentation would disappear into classified systems beyond public scrutiny. "Agent Collins, I want it clearly understood that I believe these children were deliberately exposed to radioactive materials as part of an unauthorized human experiment. Their continued federal custody constitutes tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. Collins's expression hardened. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Brennan. I hope you have evidence to support such claims. Ruth met his gaze steadily, her trembling hand somehow steady as she prepared her final gambit. I have medical documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence that supports my conclusions, all properly preserved according to legal standards for evidence preservation. Evidence that would need to remain classified for national security purposes, Collins replied smoothly. Evidence that predates federal involvement and therefore falls under civilian medical ethics and legal protections, Ruth countered, including patient advocacy rights that supersede classification authority. The legal chess match had reached its climax. Ruth was claiming medical advocacy rights that theoretically protected patient information from federal classification, while Collins was asserting national security authority that could override civilian protections. The outcome would depend on which legal framework proved stronger in federal court. Miss Brennan, Collins said finally, you're playing a dangerous game with forces beyond your understanding. Ruth looked at Jenny, who was watching the confrontation with the uncanny awareness that serious illness sometimes brought to children. The little girl had survived radioactive poisoning, had endured days of federal custody, had somehow maintained her spirit despite everything the adult world had done to her. Agent Collins, Ruth replied, you're underestimating forces beyond your understanding. The federal agent left without another word, but Ruth knew the confrontation was far from over. By morning, she would either have successfully protected her patients from federal custody, or she would have provoked a response that could destroy any chance of justice for the Black Hollow children. Outside Jenny's window, the morning sky was beginning to lighten over mountains that held secrets worth killing for. Ruth settled back into her chair beside the child's bed, preparing for what might be her final night as their advocate. The stones might remember everything, but Ruth intended to make sure that human memory would prove stronger than institutional amnesia. Dawn broke over Charleston with the weight of finality, casting long shadows through the hospital corridors where Ruth had spent her last night as guardian of the Black Hollow children. Federal transport vehicles were already assembling in the parking lot, their black sedans and medical vans creating a motorcade that spoke of authority beyond challenge or appeal. Ruth had used the dark hours productively, working with Dr. Morrison and sympathetic hospital staff to complete her documentation project. Multiple copies of medical records, witness testimonies, and photographic evidence now existed in locations that federal agents couldn't easily discover or confiscate. But she knew that paper trails would mean nothing if she couldn't protect the living witnesses, the children whose recovery would tell the real story of what had happened in Black Hollow. Agent Collins returned at precisely 8 o'clock, flanked by medical personnel in federal uniforms and legal officials carrying court orders that would override any further resistance. The machinery of government authority was in full motion, designed to sweep away inconvenient truths with the efficiency of practiced bureaucracy. Miss Brennan, Collins began, his voice carrying the satisfaction of inevitable victory. The children are being transferred immediately to Federal Medical Research Facility 17. Specialized care for their unique condition. Ruth stood beside Jenny's bed, her hand resting protectively on the little girl's shoulder. The child was awake and alert, her fever finally broken, her breathing clear for the first time since the crisis began. The recovery was miraculous by any medical standard, but Ruth suspected it had less to do with hospital treatment than with whatever spiritual resolution Jenny had described in her fevered visions. I'm invoking patient advocacy rights, Ruth said clearly. As the attending physician during the acute phase of their illness, I have legal standing to contest any transfer that I believe compromises their medical welfare. Collins smiled, producing documents that he spread across the bedside table with the precision of a card dealer revealing a winning hand. Federal court order, signed by Judge Hamilton 3 hours ago. Medical emergency supersedes civilian advocacy claims when national security is involved. Ruth examined the legal papers, recognizing the judicial language that stripped away her remaining protections. The court order was comprehensive, designed to eliminate every loophole she might use to maintain contact with her patients. But as she read the formal language, Ruth noticed something that Collins had apparently overlooked in his confidence. "This order applies to cases involving ongoing medical emergency," Ruth said carefully. "What happens if the emergency status changes?" "The children remain in federal custody regardless of their recovery status," Collins replied dismissively. "Actually," Dr. Morrison interjected, stepping forward with her own legal documents, "State Health Department regulations require civilian medical clearance for any patient declared recovered from acute poisoning. Federal authority extends only to active treatment phases." Ruth felt a surge of hope as she realized what Dr. Morrison was proposing. If the children could be officially declared recovered from their acute symptoms, their cases would revert to civilian medical authority regardless of federal classification issues. The bureaucratic complexity that usually favored government agencies could be turned against them with the right legal maneuvering. Collins's expression shifted toward anger as he understood the implications. These children were exposed to classified materials. Their cases remain under federal jurisdiction indefinitely. "Their cases remain under medical jurisdiction until they're declared healthy," Ruth corrected, "and their recovery status can only be determined by the physicians who treated their acute symptoms." The legal standoff crystallized around medical authority versus federal security claims. Ruth was asserting that her role as treating physician gave her the right to determine when federal emergency powers no longer applied to her patients. It was a narrow legal argument, but one that could create enough bureaucratic confusion to buy time for other interventions. Collins reached for his radio, preparing to call for additional legal support, but Jenny's voice stopped him with words that changed the entire dynamic. "The stones are all gone now," the little girl announced clearly. "They went back to sleep in the deep mountain. The angry spirits aren't angry anymore." Everyone in the room turned toward the child, whose fevered ramblings had become coherent statements that somehow carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Ruth realized that Jenny was describing the resolution of whatever spiritual crisis had accompanied the medical emergency, but her words also provided an opening for a different kind of argument. "Agent Collins," Ruth said, "if the source of contamination has been neutralized, if whatever was released from the mining operation has returned to a stable state, then the national security emergency that justified federal intervention no longer exists." Collins stared at Jenny, clearly struggling to formulate a response to an argument based on a child's spiritual visions. The federal response had been predicated on ongoing danger from unstable radioactive materials, but if that danger had genuinely resolved, the legal foundation for continued federal custody became questionable. "You can't base federal policy on the fever dreams of a sick child," Collins said finally. "But you can base it on medical assessments of recovered patients," Dr. Morrison replied. "And my medical assessment is that these children are no longer suffering from acute radioactive poisoning. Their blood counts have normalized, their symptoms have resolved, and they show no signs of ongoing exposure." Ruth understood that they were creating a medical and legal framework that could challenge federal authority without directly confronting national security claims. By focusing on patient recovery rather than classification issues, they were operating within established medical protocols that even federal agents couldn't easily override. "I want independent medical verification," Ruth announced. "Second opinions from physicians outside federal employment, civilian doctors who can assess these children's recovery status without security clearances or classification restrictions." Collins's reaction confirmed that Ruth had found the pressure point that worried federal authorities most. Independent medical assessment would create documentation beyond government control, would establish civilian medical authority that could be defended in open court proceedings. "Miss Brennan," Collins said slowly, "you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be." Ruth looked around the hospital room, at the little girl who had survived deliberate poisoning, at the medical equipment that had kept her alive, at the adults whose decisions would determine whether justice ever emerged from the Black Hollow tragedy. "Complicated is what happens when people poison children and then try to cover it up," Ruth replied. Simple is what happens when medical professionals do their jobs without interference from agencies more concerned with protecting themselves than protecting patients. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, but before anyone could escalate further, Mary Ellen appeared in the doorway with news that shifted the entire balance of power. "Ruth!" she called out, her voice carrying excitement and vindication. "The television people are here." Channel 8 from Pittsburgh, and someone from the newspaper. They want to interview the families about what happened to our children. Ruth felt a surge of triumph as she understood what Mary Ellen was announcing. Despite federal efforts to control information, despite the forced evacuation of Black Hollow, despite the systematic suppression of evidence, the story had reached journalists willing to investigate and broadcast the truth. Collins moved quickly toward his radio, but Ruth was quicker. "Agent Collins," she said loudly, ensuring that her words would carry to the journalists gathering in the corridor outside. "Are you planning to prevent news reporters from interviewing the families of children who were poisoned in a federal research project?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, creating the kind of public confrontation that federal agencies worked desperately to avoid. Collins could order the hospital sealed, could invoke national security restrictions on media access, but doing so would confirm everything the journalists suspected about government cover-ups. "No comment," Collins said finally. But his retreat toward damage control told Ruth everything she needed to know about the strength of her position. The next several hours brought a parade of reporters, cameramen, and investigators drawn by the story of children poisoned in a mining town and then hidden by federal authorities. Ruth gave carefully worded interviews that focused on medical facts rather than speculation about government conspiracy. But the implications were clear enough for any competent journalist to follow. By afternoon, the story was broadcasting on regional television networks, with headlines that congressional representatives would find impossible to ignore. Ruth watched from Jenny's bedside as politicians who had never heard of Black Hollow suddenly discovered urgent concerns about environmental safety and government transparency. The federal medical transport vehicles remained in the parking lot, but they no longer carried the authority of inevitable outcome. Public attention had created political pressure that even national security classifications couldn't entirely suppress. Collins and his team found themselves trapped between their original mission and the new reality of media scrutiny. Dr. Morrison approached Ruth during the evening shift change, her expression mixing exhaustion with cautious optimism. "The federal facility transfer has been postponed, pending congressional inquiry," she reported. "Someone with serious political influence is asking uncomfortable questions about research protocols and informed consent." Ruth nodded, understanding that they had won a temporary victory rather than final resolution. The children would remain in civilian medical care, while politicians and bureaucrats negotiated the boundaries between national security and public accountability. But the delay bought time for the legal challenges that could eventually force full disclosure. Jenny stirred in her hospital bed, her eyes opening with the clarity that had marked her recovery from the mysterious fever. "Miss Ruth," the child said softly, "the mountain spirits said to thank you. They said you listened when nobody else would." Ruth took Jenny's small hand, feeling the strength that had returned with healing. "What else did they say, sweetheart?" "They said the stones will stay asleep now, as long as people remember what happened here. As long as someone tells the story true." Ruth understood the responsibility that Jenny was placing on her shoulders. The medical crisis had resolved, the immediate danger had passed, but the larger obligation remained, to ensure that the truth about Black Hollow became part of the historical record that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. Over the following weeks, as congressional hearings unfolded and federal investigations proceeded, Ruth worked with journalists and legal advocates to document the full scope of what had happened in the isolated mining community. The radioactive materials were eventually traced to experimental weapons research. The targeting of specific families was confirmed through classified documents that congressional pressure forced into public disclosure. The Carver Mining Company faced criminal charges, several federal officials were demoted or transferred, and new regulations were established to prevent unauthorized human experimentation in isolated communities. The Black Hollow families received financial compensation, though no amount of money could truly address what their children had endured. Ruth remained in Charleston as the children completed their recovery, serving as their medical advocate and primary witness in the legal proceedings that followed. Her testimony, delivered with the same steady determination that had marked her confrontation with Samuel Cray, became crucial evidence in establishing the pattern of deliberate exposure and systematic cover-up. But perhaps the most important outcome was the change in how medical professionals understood their obligations to patient advocacy. Ruth's refusal to accept corporate or federal authority over medical decisions became a case study in nursing schools, a reminder that individual conscience sometimes provided the only protection against institutional power. Jenny made a complete recovery, as did all the other children, though they carried trace amounts of radioactive isotopes that would require lifelong monitoring. She grew up to become a teacher, working with Cherokee cultural preservation programs that honored the traditional knowledge her fever dreams had channeled during the crisis. Mary Ellen moved her family to a small town in Tennessee, where she became an advocate for mining families affected by environmental contamination. She often spoke at conferences and congressional hearings, her testimony linking the Black Hollow case to broader patterns of corporate negligence and government complicity. Thomas Whitehawk lived long enough to see his grandson graduate from college with a degree in environmental science. He spent his final years working with tribal councils and environmental groups, sharing traditional ecological knowledge that complemented scientific approaches to land protection and community health. Ruth herself returned to Pittsburgh eventually, where she established a clinic specializing in environmental health issues affecting rural mining communities. The tremor in her left hand never fully disappeared, but she learned to see it as a reminder of her own vulnerability rather than a sign of weakness. The clinic's walls displayed photographs from Black Hollow, including one of Jenny taken during her hospital recovery, her young face showing the strength that had carried her through an ordeal no child should have faced. Visitors often asked about the story behind the images, and Ruth would explain how a community's courage had overcome forces that seemed insurmountable. Sometimes, late at night, when the clinic was empty and the city was quiet, Ruth would think about Jenny's words regarding stones that remembered everything. She understood now that human memory required constant effort to maintain, that institutional amnesia was always working to erase inconvenient truths from the historical record. But she also understood that some stories possessed a power that transcended official suppression, that carried their own authority through the lived experiences of people who refused to forget what they had witnessed and survived. The mountains around Black Hollow remained largely empty after the evacuation, though environmental monitoring stations now dotted the landscape like mechanical sentinels. The mining operation never resumed, the deep tunnels sealed with concrete and warning markers that would endure for generations. Local Cherokee communities considered the area sacred again, a place where spirits had been disturbed and then restored to rest through the intervention of people who honored both traditional wisdom and modern medical knowledge. They maintained ceremonial sites near the old mining entrances, ensuring that future generations would remember both the danger and the healing that had occurred there. Ruth visited the site every few years, drawn by obligations she couldn't fully articulate to herself. The mountains looked peaceful in their abandonment, but she could still feel the weight of what had happened there, the echoes of choices made and consequences faced when individual conscience collided with institutional power. On her final visit, now an elderly woman whose trembling had spread to both hands, Ruth found a new marker placed by the Cherokee community. It read simply, "Here children were harmed, and here people chose to listen when the stones cried out for justice." Standing beside that marker, Ruth understood that Jenny's fever dreams had contained more truth than anyone had realized at the time. The stones had indeed remembered everything, but more importantly, the people had chosen to remember as well. And in that choice, individual weakness had somehow become collective strength sufficient to challenge forces that seemed beyond challenge. The story of Black Hollow entered the historical record not as a footnote in classified files, but as a testament to the power of medical conscience and community courage when confronted with institutional betrayal. It became required reading in medical schools, law schools, and environmental studies programs, ensuring that future generations would understand both the vulnerabilities and the responsibilities that defined their professional obligations. Ruth died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. Her final words reportedly concerning children who needed medical care and stones that held memory in their silent depths. Her funeral was attended by dozens of former patients, fellow healthcare workers, and advocates who had been inspired by her example of principled defiance against overwhelming authority. Jenny, now a grandmother herself, delivered the eulogy that captured Ruth's legacy with words that echoed across decades. She taught us that being weak in some ways can make you strong in the ways that matter most. And she proved that sometimes one nurse with a trembling hand can move mountains when she refuses to let children suffer in silence. The Black Hollow Clinic building still stood, converted now into a community center that provided services to families affected by environmental contamination throughout Appalachia. A small plaque by the entrance honored Ruth Brennan and the other healthcare workers who had chosen medical ethics over institutional loyalty during the crisis of 1952. The mountains kept their secrets, but the people who lived among them had learned to listen more carefully to warnings carried on the wind and embedded in the stone. They understood now that some kinds of strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from choosing to act despite it, from refusing to let fear of consequences override commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. And in the deeper places where traditional knowledge met modern understanding, where Cherokee wisdom intersected with medical science, the story was remembered as a teaching about the responsibilities that came with privilege, the obligations that defined true healing, and the power that emerged when individual conscience found the courage to challenge systems that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage. The stones slept peacefully in their mountain depths, but their memory lived on in the choices made by people who understood that some truths were too important to bury, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against their telling.